From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. I'm Carolyn Brown. I'm the director of the Office of Scholarly Programs and the John W. Kluge Center. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon for what I know is going to be a really interesting talk by Professor Jeffrey Alexander of Yale on a book that he worked on when he was here in the Kluge Center in, seems like a long time ago, spring of 2009. And the subject of the talk and the book is The Performance of Politics, Obama's Victory and the Democratic Struggle for Power. Let me remind you to please turn off any cell phones and other kinds of electrical equipment, which might bong and beep and whatnot and interfere with the recording. The event is sponsored by the John W. Kluge Center, which began with a very generous endowment from John W. Kluge, who just recently died. And his vision with that of the librarian was to find a way of supporting the world's premier top senior scholars and to provide opportunities for the rising generation of top junior scholars to spend time at the library conducting research in the collections and databases. The center, in connection with that, promotes small enterprises. We'll do small conferences, lectures like this, small symposia. And if you're not on our email list, I would suggest that you go to the front page of the library, lower left-hand side, and sign up for email notifications. And you can also learn more about the Kluge Center on the front page. Our speaker today, Dr. Jeffrey Alexander, is a Lillian Chavenson Saden Professor of Sociology at Yale University. He works in the areas of theory, culture, and politics, exploring aspects of modern life in terms of their symbolic and moral meanings. Not all sociologists really do that. It's a very, to me, interesting, particularly interesting kind of focus. Among his recent and numerous works, just give you some titles to give you a sense of his focus. The Meanings of Social Life, a Cultural Sociology, with Philip Smith, the Cambridge companion to Durkheim, with Bernard Geisen and Jason Mast, Social Performance, Symbolic Action, Cultural Pragmatics, and Ritual, The Civic Sphere, with Kenneth Thompson, A Contemporary Introduction to Sociology, Culture and Society in Transition. In this new book, The Politics of Performance, Alexander revisits the Obama 2008 presidential campaign, which seems, for those of us who've been in Washington, it seems like it must have been 2 or 3 decades ago. The climate has changed so much, but it wasn't actually that long, and it might be a good reminder as we near the 2010 midterm elections. Alexander argues that images, emotion, and performance are central features of the political battle for power. Winning depends on creating images so that candidates can become heroes. Even though I think the pundits focus on strategy and certainly a lot about money and demography and other kinds of issues, Jeffrey has focused on the power that the candidates receive from giving the most persuasive performance. So I'm sure that all of you will find this a very interesting take on probably Washington's most famous consumer sport, which is politics. So please welcome Dr. Alexander.
Thank you, Carolyn and Robert, for putting this together and for inviting me. Seems like too long ago. I'd love to come back. I want to begin this presentation of the performance of politics not by speaking about the 2008 presidential election, which I call the democratic struggle for power, but by talking a bit about the broader intellectual framework within which it fits, which is the relation between culture and politics. Now, in contemporary discussions about who gets elected and why, there's, in my view, way too much emphasis on how demography determines just about everything. Everything about elections. It provides a favored way to handicap elections before they happen and a facile way to explain them after they're over. The argument goes it had to be this way or that way because of demographic interests or demographic shifts. My book takes the explanation of politics in a very different direction, away from the so-called structural or demographic factors into the realm of culture. I see the struggle for power not as determined mechanically, but as motivated by the search for meaning. My approach comes out of a broad intellectual revolution that has coursed through philosophy and social science in recent decades, and it's called the cultural turn. My book brings this cultural turn to politics and power where it hasn't really been before. But there's a problem with culture as an explanatory variable. It's too big, too gross, too vague, in a word, too indeterminate. You can't say culture determined the election, even if you're certain that meaning-making was central to the power struggle. You need something that is more narrow in its scope, more situational and more action-specific. And this is where the idea of performance comes in. A performance isn't just about culture, it's symbolic action. Performance is an action that aims to get others, audiences, to understand the meanings of our actions as we wish them, consciously or unconsciously, to be understood. It's in this book that I first presented these ideas about performance as a way of thinking about culture in action. The idea of cultural performance points to pragmatic effectiveness, to all the things that go into making symbolic action succeed in the real world of the here and now. The power of the script is central to the pragmatics of symbolic action, but so is the rhetoric, tone, and tempo projected by a political actor. So is having the power to procure a stage, which today means getting covered by the media. But even if you have all of these in place, and you send out what you think is an effective message over or through the media, there are still big stumbling blocks to an effective performance. Nobody can predict how audiences will react or how messages will be mediated and interpreted by journalists. In other words, my aim here is to dissolve the distinction between the supposedly rational or factual worlds of social life and the supposedly fictional, made-up worlds of aesthetics or drama. I'm trying to bring these two together, and I would argue that fiction is very realistic and realism is very fictional. I'm convinced that only if we break down the Chinese wall between realism and aesthetics can we understand how politics operates today. But that brings me to the next. Oh, I forgot to show this slide. This is the structural similarities of fictional and factual situations. So the question is, if you want to break down this barrier, the next question I think people think about is performative politics something recent? I would say no. I think politics never did not involve performance, to use a double negative. Even in ancient Greece, where the Socratic dialogue is said to have reigned supreme, there were schools of rhetoric everywhere. It's true that the Greek palace provided the DNA that codes democratic politics as if it were all about rational deliberation. But debates in the polis were not, in fact, very rational. They were highly performative and informed by rhetoric. Still, history does make a difference. As societies get larger and more complex, there's a tremendous increase in the mediation of performance. Speaker and audience become ever more separated from one another to the point that there's hardly ever actual co-presence. The symbolic projection of meaning from political performer to citizen audience becomes more and more indirect, in fact, completely indirect. It becomes more difficult, more complex, and much more iffy. Now, in the days of our founding fathers, people tended to know one another personally, and electors met candidates and even voted face to face. In the years since, there's emerged an increasingly complex mediation between actor and audience. So let's say 100 years after the founding, the mediation looked like this. It's a pretty big difference. The communicative machinery mediating between political actor and citizen audience has today become truly massive. So you think of that difference. You had the founding fathers, you have 100 years, 120 years ago, 130, you see today. It's this extension, this stretching out of the communicative process, which you might call the distension of political performance, that explains the almost desperate sense today that communication, coherent, accurate, revealing, has become virtually impossible. This anxiety is manifest among commentators, among consultants, among politicians, and everyday people in the citizen audience. Here's an example of an article written on September 16th, 2008 by the Times main reporter, lead reporter, let's say, covering the election, Adam Nagorny, who's now the Washington bureau chief, to the effect that carefully shaped messages are now a campaign relic, and he developed the case that it was impossible to communicate. I take that this very influential article and reporter revealed the anxiety about communication that exists in this kind of massively mediated communicative situation we live in. This anxiety is real and it's revealing, but it's also deeply misleading, because sometimes messages do reach audiences, and sometimes citizen audiences do get meanings, which is simply to say that political performances often succeed. And it is the candidate who succeeds who most often wins and takes power. To be a successful performer, then, a political candidate must appear not to be performing. It's paradoxical, but that's the basic law of performative politics. With intense performative politics, you are successful to the degree that you don't seem to be performing. Her action and speech must be seen as authentic, not as constructed, as natural and sincere. This might seem to be easy, but it's very, very difficult. In a complex society where performance is distended, it's just about the hardest thing in the world. So during election campaigns, the worst thing the media and opponents can say about you is that you seem wooden, artificial, contrived, a puppet on a string pulled by invisible others, directing one's action and writing one's script. And both McCain and Obama were accused of that time and time again. The idea is, you're not yourself, you're not real, you're not an authentic person. You're an instrument being run by other people. That means for these people who are saying this, the performance has failed. Only if you're viewed as authentic can you become a powerful symbol, a collective representation of the hopes and dreams of civil society. Only then can you symbolize, and symbolizing is the key to performative success. So much for the broad intellectual landscape. Now I want to turn to see how this gets played out in the struggle for power in 2008. The first thing I'd say is that for politicians to symbolize, they have to become heroes. As these brilliant 2008 comic book covers suggest, what I've just said needs a bit of subtle qualification. Politicians must become heroes in the collective imagination. It's not whether you are a hero, it's whether you seem to be a hero. It is a performative challenge, and it involves a lot of difficult cultural work. You become a hero for your countrymen by offering them the promise of salvation. To do this, you must persuade them that the country needs to be saved, that we are in a terrible crisis. Struggles for big-time political power are filled with rhetoric about the utter disaster to which our times have fallen. Apocalypse looms. If my opponent gets into power, disaster will occur. And the whole world will look like this. If you elect me, however, the world will be saved. And we'll have the coming of a new day, a new millennium. Throughout the 2008 struggle for power, McCain and Obama both narrated our times as in a profound crisis. They did so, however, in fatefully different ways. For Obama, we were in the midst of a great and terrible domestic crisis, growing inequality and intolerance, rampant corruption, secretive government, curtailment of civil liberties, precious resources squandered on war. For McCain, the crisis is outside civil society, not inside it. It's about the enemy at our gates. Quote, the great battle of the 21st century is the struggle against Islamic extremism, end quote. A statement McCain repeated throughout his campaign. We must suck it up. be strong and, quote, fight, fight, fight. This was a titanic battle of heroes, and it goes all the way back to Homer. McCain plays Achilles to Obama's Hector. The Republican values physical courage and loyalty and military strength. And he wants glory on the field of battle, above all. He aligns his memoirs and hopes to align our collective memories with Washington, Grant, Eisenhower, MacArthur. Obama plays Hector to McCain's Achilles. Hector was reluctant to leave the walls of Troy because of his love for family and city. Like Hector, Obama's values are more urbane, less military, more civilization, more about democracy than domination. His heroes are Lincoln, Roosevelt, and Johnson, and the greatest civil hero of the American century, Martin Luther King. But the struggle for power in 2008 was not a good time for military heroes. The public was turned off to the Iraq War. One poll claimed that 65% of Americans were bored with the topic. And there was a rapidly abating sense of danger from foreign terrorism. At the same time, there was a growing sense of domestic unease, worry about the growing inequality that was said to pose a danger to civil society, worry about the government rot and indifference that Katrina had exposed, and a gnawing fear of a slow-motion economic decline. All of this was background. Nothing was decided, and everything was in play by the end of June 2008, when the post-primary general election campaign got underway. Obama was ahead on points, but he did not have a statistically significant lead, let alone cultural domination. So I want to turn now to the three primary plot points that did determine the outcome of the campaign, in my view, which were celebrity metaphor, Palin effect, and financial crisis. This is a poll of polls that I constructed from what I considered the best polls. And if you look closely, you can see these three periods. I'll have slides slicing them up later. There were three periods after June 3rd when Republicans came up close and often surpassed the Democrats until late September, when the election was basically decided. I'm going to tell you a little bit how I approached these three plot points in The Performance of Power, and then to find out the rest, you'll just have to buy the book. But I guess you know how it turned out, so it's not a mystery. Let's start with celebrity metaphor. I'll say a little bit more about that. When the Democratic campaign, with the Democratic campaign still worrying about their leaders' foreign policy credentials, Obama makes a daring leap in late July in 2008. He takes a hiatus from his domestic campaigning and launches an unprecedented foreign trip to the Middle East and Europe. It's a risky move, but as it unfolds, it's widely perceived to be an extraordinary success. Obama is taking over the symbolic space that McCain had declared personal property. But performative politics is tricky. Symbols are multivalent, and by skill, craftiness, and sometimes just plain dumb luck, the meanings can be turned in a completely different way. Every hero has a shadow. The more he becomes a hero, the more he exposes himself to the charge of hubris. And if he is convicted of arrogance, a political figure can be transformed from hero to demagogue overnight. This is what happens to Obama. Media and political experts are awestruck, but no bump appears in the polls after his trip. The brilliant performance artist in charge of the Republican campaign, aka Stephen Schmidt, seizes the moment. He creates a web ad declaring Obama a celebrity. An arrogant, arugula-eating, health food intaking, Ivy League educated, holier-than-thou, flying too close to the sun, better than your average Joe celebrity. The ad goes viral, and the metaphor spreads like wildfire, with many son of celebrity ads in its wake. It's fascinating how a metaphor has so much power. Celebrity metaphor sharply affects the polls and throws the Obama campaign on its heels for 5 weeks. In the run-up to the Democratic convention, Republicans claim, in fact, that the platform being erected for Obama's acceptance speech is copied from Greek temples for the gods. In the event, Obama's August 31st speech and the extraordinary Americana surrounding it belie Republican hopes and allay Democratic fears. Obama's performance not only staunches the bleeding, but repairs his cultural standing. This is the poll of polls for the 5 weeks of celebrity metaphor. And you can see how the Republicans came up, and then in the last days of the month, there emerged a new separation. But no sooner had Obama made his remarkable recovery than Sarah Palin burst on the scene. She is a sensation, of course, an overnight star. She's touted as a hero of Alaskan civil society and a fearless domestic reformer. Palin performs the role of God-fearing, gun-toting, post-feminist Annie Oakley. Palin's symbol comes from the heartland of America's frontier myth. 3 weeks of hide-and-seek, rhetorical gaffes, public ridicule, and media exposés later, buyer's remorse sets in. The hero symbol deflates, and Palin effect sizzles. Or fizzles, I should say. It did sizzle, then it fizzled. So once again, you see Palin's great success, the blue ribbon, and then the Democrats recover, the Republicans go down. And then on September 14th, the financial crisis bursts into the American public sphere. Realists claim, in retrospect, that this economic implosion in itself determined McCain's defeat. This, however, was decidedly not the case. It is not the supposedly real referent, but the symbol that encases reality that directs the struggle for power. In fact, for a week after the crash, neither side had an advantage. McCain blinks first. The former soldier is supposed to be cool under fire, but now he seems irrational. Quote, "The fundamentals of our economy are good." You remember that? He seems also to be impulsive. He calls off the campaign to parachute into bipartisan negotiations in Washington. And then, after making things a lot worse, he calls the campaign back on again. Meanwhile, Citizen Obama remains conspicuously cool, calm, and collected. The performative contrast ensures Obama's cultural triumph. It allows the Democrat, for the first time, to take a statistically significant lead in the campaign, and he never looks back again. In closing, I want to turn to the question that no doubt you've all been asking yourselves throughout this brief talk. How could Obama have done such an extraordinarily effective job of performing politics during his campaign for the presidency and be in such a disastrous position 2 years after winning it? Now, for conservatives, the answer is simple. As one of my colleagues at Yale told me, the public finally sees who Obama really was all the time. I regard this as a partisan response, and much too easy, because it takes reality for granted, as if there is a real Obama and he was just covered up before. As if reality isn't performatively enacted, as if facts and events can be considered at all outside of a cultural framework. So my answer would be different. I'd say Obama seems to have lost his ability to symbolize, not only for the center of the citizen audience, but for those on its left. Obama became a throbbing representation of hope, progress, and civil salvation, but he hardly seems able to symbolize these collective feeling states now. In his inaugural address, President Obama projected a new and sober style that seemed designed not to excite but to dampen the great hopes that candidate Obama had aroused for change. Since then, the president has spoken frequently of doom and difficulty, only rarely of hope and glory. He predicts it will take a long time for things to get better, and he withdraws to the White House to engage in technical deliberations and legislative sausage-making. The media today and for the last months have been filled with reports that the president and his administration are not generating excitement, that he does not seem engaged, that he is distant, too academic. These are a description of a political actor who has lost his way, of a performance that is falling flat. In imperial China, the emperor governed with the mandate of heaven. If there was a great natural disaster, such as a flood or an earthquake, it was widely believed that the heavenly mandate had been withdrawn from the emperor, and he fell from grace. After promising to steward markets back to health and spending stupendous amounts of money to do so, the Obama character has had to confront rising unemployment and economic stagnation. And after 12 months of Herculean labor on a health care reform bill, the tangible results so far have been virtually nil. Ditto for financial reform. Negotiating with putative enemies to this point has proven no more successful. Iran still threatens, China still rises, the earth still warms. Superman, who could leap over the tallest buildings with a single bound, would have plugged up the deep-water horizon rig faster than a speeding bullet. President Obama could not stop it. And it took many weeks of frustrating negotiation before a British oil company managed to do so. None of this is to say that Obama has not been an effective president. It is to say, however, that he does not seem to be an effective president at the moment. Now, effective narratives are something else. An effective narrative moves from an initial conflict to a standoff in mid-story and then to climactic resolution and denouement. In the long-playing Barack Obama story, we are stuck in second, mired in the muddled middle without an end in sight. We remain anxious and unfulfilled. The meaning many Americans thought they had made in electing Obama is dissolving before their eyes. As Democrats have stumbled, new dramatists have seized the public stage, and they are spinning powerful counter-narratives. The Tea Party is cymbling on all four cultural cylinders. The right has its finger on the mythical mother lode once again. For we few faithful who still worship at the shrine of Obama, however, hope remains, because the show is not over yet. No matter what transpires in the coming days, there are many more scenes left to play. Symbols are social constructions. Anything that's made can be unmade, but it can also be remade again. Thank you.
I take your point about that demographics seem overdetermined. But usually in those stories, the demographics are sort of constant, static. A state is red, a state is blue. And in your story, I feel like the audience is also static. What changes are the symbols. What changes are the leader's ability to perform. And I'm wondering about the audience. Can the audience change in terms of who decides to vote or in terms of their personal circumstances? Is there a kind of a change in how people respond to performance?
Well, I wouldn't say the audience is static. I think the audience is a participant in the performance, and audiences are very active in the same way that audiences for televisions or movies are, but their action tends to be more symbolic and projective and psychological. They tune in, they tune out. And it's very difficult to predict that, but the effects of that are decisive. So in a way, polling is a way of tracking audience reaction. And it's continuous. It's conducted by internal campaign polls and outside. There's 20 polls published every day in the United States. And, but I do see the audience as you could do a biography of the audience. The first thing is that the audience is about the only part of the audience that, well, the part that matters most is the 15% in the middle. But the left and right are also important players. So the fact that, for example, in the last 2 years, the left has turned strongly against Obama, and the right has found a fantastic narrative and a great power. That's important, and it's influenced the people in the center. I think that the center of the American public doesn't have fixed ideologies. They seem to be persuadable this way and that. And in that sense, it's very much like the public for a television show that's running out. But once they begin to make up their minds, then they kind of stick to it for a while. So, by late September, the audience had basically decided. And that's why, by the way, Palin and McCain turned to right-wing populism, not because they were they changed and become the true people, but the only place they could draw an audience was by going towards their folks, you know, the 25%. So they stopped even trying to convince the center. You know, they stopped being moderate. They lost the election.
Thank you for that. I'm wondering if in the play that is the American experience, if it just wasn't time for that theme of we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, it wasn't the moment that needed to be back in the play. And that, could you speak to that and how that theme would have resonated with all these other moments in those months from July to November and all those events?
Thank you, Mary Lou, for that. I think as a domestic hero, I mean, Obama put himself forward as a champion of reform to create a more inclusive civil sphere, more equality, and you have a kind of basic discourse of American democracy, which is about liberty and freedom on the one hand, and equality and solidarity on another. Tocqueville called them liberty and equality, and they're always in some kind of balance with each other. And I think you're right, there was a feeling among many that the American fabric had been pulled too far towards individualism, in addition to all the other problems, and that we needed to restore a kind of a commitment to everybody again. And Obama represented one of the great, let's say, the after effects of one of the greatest movements in American history, which was the Civil Rights Movement. And he recalled Martin Luther King and Abraham Lincoln. And it was a moment of civil repair, of possibilities to sew up a rent social fabric. And the legislation that he's managed to pass since coming to power has tried to do some of that, and we'll see how effectively it's done it. But what I would want to say is that we have to see the argument, let's say liberty and justice for all, as an effort to convince people that this was the moment for this. So he had to be extraordinary. He had to symbolize this in himself. His campaign workers had to. And it was very much open. So yes, presidencies and victories, they are often thought of retrospectively as representing a sweeping tide or the movement of a pendulum. But we need to study what allows it actually to happen, you know, in the moment.
I wanted to ask you a question that is a little technical. It's about terminology.
Yeah.
Why, I mean, and it's in a way continuation of the first question. Why did you choose to speak about performance rather than spectacle? Where do you put this mediating, very powerful voices, the journalism and the other elements of a spectacle? And how do you see also the audience? I mean, why?
Yeah.
In the tradition, did you choose to use a different
terminology? I don't want to use the term spectacle because it's part of critical theory. And spectacle is a derogatory term. It's a negative term that assumes that contemporary society is a Roman circus that is and that the symbolic action is put on to fool people. So Guy Debord and other people have developed the theory of the spectacle. it's a fascinating and fertile idea, but I think it prejudges it. See, what I want to do is say that people say something is a spectacle only when the performance fails. I'm more interested not in developing a critical normative theory where I say that's a spectacle. I want to understand how everyday people, including journalists, understand what's happening. So for me, I would have a continuum. On the one hand, spectacle. On the other hand, ritual, with performance moving from one to the other. So there are genuine moments, let's say yesterday, the Chilean miners. You could say, well, that's a spectacle. I mean, there were 1,000 journalists. It was orchestrated by the government, but people didn't feel it was. They felt it was a moving, ritual moment of communal experience of life and death and rebirth, and journalists were in tears. So I don't want to use, it's a great question, but that's kind of how I'm approaching it.
Thanks very much, Jeff. Thanks very much. That was I take a great deal away from what you're saying because I am struggling with the whole concept of performative sort of work in Simón Bolívar, who was, of course, terrifically charismatic and great at the podium and had the right register of voice. But eventually lost, of course, his hold. And I don't know who it was who said it. I think it was probably David Remnick in his book about Obama. But he said, you know, candidates speak poetry and presidents speak prose. And there's something to that, you know, in my mind, the rhetoric of the election is poetry in the sense that it's taut and bullet-like and full of hope and sometimes even beautiful. And then, of course, the presidency itself takes teaching, explaining, defending, and it's a very different kind of performance. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, thanks, Marie. I mean, it's very... It's much more difficult to create a convincing performance when you're in the White House as an executive with the necessity to exercise control over the largest bureaucracy in the world. And but that's what defines the challenge from a dramaturgical point of view of a presidency, which is how can it control and how can it relate the expressive and the instrumental functions of the presidency or of power? And that's a tremendously challenging thing. And it doesn't, everything isn't under your control. So many events happen. People are taken hostage in Iran. The economy stagnates. There's all these things that happen. And so it's difficult. You can't control the environment. It's a lot different than in a movie or a play or in a small room. And the president has brought a lot of his campaign staff into the White House. He's brought his drama team, you know, his speechwriters, his Axelrods, and everything else. They're doing constant polling, et cetera, and I don't think that's bad. I think that's good, neither bad nor good. It's reality. And the press is viewed, the liberal and conservative press are viewed as the enemy by all presidential candidates and all presidents. And the press views politicians as their enemy. I interviewed a series of important New York Times journalists who covered Obama and were very liberal. They hated Obama. Not personally, they voted for him, but this confrontational, because the aim of the president is to send messages out to the people, to have a connection, to have fusion. But the darn thing is that this giant media machine is this screen, so everything has to go through it, and nothing could be more frustrating. So the press, which is gigantic, feels as if the candidate or the president is avoiding them in every possible way and is controlling them like they're in the Soviet Union, a totalitarian society, and they are. You know, the journalist told me how they were assigned minders whenever it became noticed that they were going to do a story about something. There'd be this kind of person who would start attaching themselves to them, who would follow them around and ask them what they wanted and could they help them. So it's a very clumsy prospect, and I suppose, I think our view, to go back to your question of whether a president speaks poetry or prose, is often retrospective. When we look back, we say, for example, Reagan was a brilliant communicator and very successful, but during his presidency, there were the moments of glory, and there were tons of difficulties, and he didn't leave office as a great president. It was, so as I say, I agree with you. Prose, poetry. Of course, many candidates speak bad poetry and can't speak prose, and but I wonder whether Obama has tried to be poetic enough during his presidency, and why he has. Sometimes I feel Obama is the last Enlightenment figure who feels that people are motivated by rationality and reason. He actually seems to think that. So that means the whole 20th century intellectual history didn't exist. That starts with Freud's interpretation of dreams, published in 1900, and goes on from there. So he felt that once he got elected, he could come in and reason with people and do reasonable things and make laws, and, well, hey, didn't work. And he's been confronted by postmodernity and the kind of the irrationality of the human psyche. And I don't think he should have put aside the poetry cap so quickly.
I'm intrigued, and I agree with your emphasis on salvation as something that a presidential candidate promises the electorate. What I'm curious about, and I don't know whether you've thought about it or not, whether in societies that are not overwhelmingly Christian as ours and many others are, this need to promise or allude to salvation is as important in electoral campaigns. I would suggest maybe, although my familiarity with Hinduism is not great, but maybe in India, maybe the politicians don't stress that aspect of things as much.
Very good question. I mean, that's a question as to whether our own Judeo-Christian civilization is specific in the way that it looks at salvation. And I mean, and as you know, that's a debate in cultural history. So somebody like Joseph Campbell has definitely argued, and I think folklorists have argued pretty convincingly, that the notion of the hero as a salvation figure is not specific to the Judeo-Christian or Islamic tradition. It's everywhere in human history. It doesn't have the exact same kind of contours, but it's very pervasive, and that's why I use Homer and as a way of looking at heroes rather than, let's say, the prophetic tradition of the Old Testament or Jesus in the New Testament, because this goes back to very obviously pagan, pre-Christian ideas about saving the society from danger and heroes. And if we look at Indian society, we see a series of these semi-godlike figures, from Mahatma Gandhi to Mrs. Gandhi, and a kind of cult of demigod kind of people who are given extraordinary powers and whose charisma is passed on through blood and very irrational kinds of forces. And communism, of course, which is the most atheistic of any organized political religion, is filled with salvation and heroes and mummies and mausoleums and, you know, all this kind of stuff.
Sometimes in the sort of intellectual higher end of the press, say like the Columbia Journalism Review, you would see an article during the campaign bemoaning the coverage, the sort of horse race coverage, where, say, a YouTube ad created by a Republican campaign consultant would be taken as seriously as an event as, say, the collapse of some of the largest companies in the country. Do you think people who write such articles are sort of in the same sinking Enlightenment boat with the president, and that or do you feel that there is some impact that the coverage has of the various events you chose?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, in political theory, there's a tradition from Plato through Habermas that suggests that Jürgen Habermas, the most famous living democratic political philosopher, which says that in a democracy we should strive to be rational, deliberate, down to earth, and dialogical. Therefore, in political campaigns or in everyday life after somebody's elected, people get very irritated and alarmed by the trivial appearance of politics becoming soap opera, becoming melodrama. I feel that the rational tradition, the Socratic tradition, should be emphasized as much as possible. It's a normative argument, a moral argument that let's try to not let our emotions get the better of us. Let's talk about really important things. How do we solve these massive problems? Like Thomas Friedman's column, you know, every 2 days a week is, hey, we have all these problems. Why isn't anybody talking about them? But I also think that it's deeply irrational on the part of rational people to think that politics or anything else in the public life can be simply deliberative and quasi-scientific. That was an error made by the progressives in the late 19th and early 20th century, by the idea that we could, so we don't, I mean, I think that we don't need to ourselves as analysts get caught up in this. We should stand back from it. We should analyze it. And my contribution would be to say that we have to think of it as theater and not be ourselves caught up in it. But this is life. So if we want I think Obama's great contribution to more egalitarian and inclusive politics was his extraordinary capacity for performative drama. And so it's not the better argument, it's the better arguer, I think, and he did that.
Thank you. Thanks for that presentation. Really enjoyed it. So I imagine you might say more about this in the book, but to what extent do you see, like in your presentation, you talked about the performances that the political teams and actors were generating, and then this sort of, you know, response to it in the form of the polling. To what extent do you see that polling actually becoming parts of the performance, and maybe in sort of feedback loop or something? And I say this because I remember watching the candidates and then checking the polls and trying to figure out what the relationship between these might be. And of course, there is no easy one relationship, you know. So I wonder if you might.
There's no easy one-to-one relationship between
the, like, or no cause and effect between, say, performance and poll results. Yeah.
Well, right. I mean, the first thing is we have to think of the public as an audience. So that means that they're receptive to one degree or another, but they're also skeptical. So, but as I think the first questioner pointed out, this work isn't from the point of view of the audience. But I think what's important for me and where the audience becomes this tremendously significant silent actor in the performance of politics is that the American public is thought of as being very, very rational and wise. So that no politician can ever speak down to the American public. They always say, and if they think the public may not be doing something right, they say that they've been unfairly informed. They've been misinformed by something. And they always say, I will never talk down to the American public. I did some research where I went to New Hampshire during the primaries and went to the New Hampshire Primary Museum, which is a shrine to the wisdom and the rationality and intelligence of the American voter. And I believe that this mythical sense of the power of the individual voter is a big part in the drama. It's a kind of regulating myth that is, and it's good, isn't it? I mean, you know, it's in a totalitarian society, they think the average person's a complete dunce, you know, and in an authoritarian society, they think people are so irrational that they have to have. So, but here we think the voters are these brilliant, wise, sage people who can't be fooled. And so this is a kind of presence at every moment. And that's what that's why polls are so important, because we keep listening for the voice of this rational person. What do the voters think about this? You know, and then they'll be interviewing a few people and they'll show the polls, and it's a constant conversation, which is absolutely fascinating. Polls are a scientific way of aggregating people into the rational voter, the person who we're all dedicated to. And the voters, by the way, are never wrong. You've heard that, haven't you? Voters are never wrong, and the best man is always elected. The best man won. Absolutely. Once the vote is taken, it could be by 1/10, 1/5, 1/100th, or 3 percentage points, and it's always suck it up. The voters have spoken. The best man won, except in 2000. Anybody else?
You said that a successful performance is when the performance seems to be authentic and that the performer is not performing. But all the time, I mean, even when we're watching a performance, however engaged we are, and however much even if we're crying while reading a book or watching a film, we know that it's a performance. It's both are happening at the same time. It's not simply that we're completely convinced. We want to know a good actor is someone who is bringing themselves to the performance, but we know that they're acting. So when Obama was accused of being a celeb, there seems to be a sort of degree of bad faith involved. Like, oh, you know, this person's acting. We all know he's acting. So could you say a bit more about what you think's going on when a performance that everybody knows is a performance is exposed as a performance?
Well, I think that well, first of all, in my view, all action has a performative dimension. So if you have a boyfriend and you're in love with him, Do you think that he's performing? I hope not. So, in other words, yet he is, in a sense, in a non-pejorative sense, he is trying to communicate through his external cover the kind of symbolic meanings that he hopes that you will understand. And I think there's a continuum. So even now, of course, when we see a performance in the stage or in a theater, in a movie, one part of our mind knows this isn't real. Otherwise, we'd be psychotic in some way. But I would say that there is a variation between something we feel quite separated from and say this is bad acting or this is just a script, and something we get very absorbed in. So I would need to insist for my argument to make sense that there's a continuum. I can grant you that one part of your mind knows it's a performance, but you can still get very much swept in so that you really think that Marlon Brando is a white working class ethnic person. And you really believe that. And there's other people, but if somebody else was playing that role, you'd say, hey, what is that guy trying to do? Imitate a white ethnic. So with Obama, and nobody wants to be thought of as somebody who's trying to manipulate an audience to think that there's something that they aren't. So Obama is presenting himself as an idealistic, charismatic leader in the mold of Martin Luther King, one who uses performance, as King did, for an ethical purpose, not for his own ego. So when he's accused of being a celebrity, this is insulting and it's dangerous because it suggests that he is out for himself and not for the American people, and that he's projecting an artificial self. Celebrity is a very negative word. Even though Americans love celebrity, they're thought to be famous for being famous and selfish, and it's not good. Being a star is better, and being a great man is even better.
Yeah, I have a question. It's about the trip to Europe, Obama's trip to Europe, and also trying to understand perhaps where Obama fits into the kind of the relationship between the left and the right in modern on the global stage. Because there's no doubt that the trip to Europe was a massive success in Europe. I mean, he was welcomed in Berlin, in London. I mean, it was reported on the news as a huge event. I mean, bigger than a political event. I mean, I would argue even bigger than perhaps a large part of the UK elections. And I think that there was something about his trip to Europe which struck a nerve or a note with the European populations, which was, again, salvatory, but salvatory because here you had somebody from America who would that was talking apparently from the left, and of course who was talking from the left, from a progressive position, and at a point when European politics has entered a sort of post-ideological malaise, where post-Blair, Sarkozy, where the democratic the elements to which the UK electorate perceive their democracy to be, as in the ability to write on a vote on health or education, have all been passed over to the private sector. So there's a real sense in which democracy in the West, in Europe, has suffered. So I wondered if you might be able to sort of locate the success that he got, in Europe, with what that meant in the US, because I don't know, I wasn't here, and also why the McCain campaign didn't exploit it at that point. The reasons why perhaps he had succeeded in Europe. But also,
why the McCain campaign? What?
Well, if the reasons why Obama was so successful in Europe were because of his appeal to the the generation of the 60s generation who were suffering this post-ideological malaise, why that wasn't drawn into the actual campaign back in America, and then why it seems to have now manifested post the election.
Well, I think it's really a matter of audiences. A performance has layered and multiple audiences, and one of the most critical issues, if you want to use this theory of performance, is trying to find out what are the audiences that are involved in this performance and where is the actor aiming. So one of the problems for Obama is he wanted to prove that he was able to be an effective intermediary with foreign countries, but he ended up showing that he could be very successful with European audiences. And Americans don't like Europeans. Americans, as you know, they have a very, very ambivalent relationship to Europe and Europe to the United States, certainly on the mass level. So it used to be that Americans felt Europeans were superior to them. All educated people wanted to travel to Europe. They would take their education there. Then after World War II, it's a bit more ambivalent. But back home, as soon as it looked like these European audiences were getting very excited, that was a danger for Obama, because it could be played to make him look like a snob, that he cared about Europe but didn't care about the United States. And so McCain went shopping for bratwurst in a Milwaukee grocery store and had a conversation with a housewife who was shopping. He said, "Here I am shopping for bratwurst. My opponent is off exciting millions of people outside the Angel in Berlin." I mean, so there was a lot of contrast that was being played like this. And it turns out that just for the domestic politics, that actually the trip was a disastrous mistake. He never should have done it. And on the other hand, in terms of his ability to make foreign policy afterward, it might not have been nearly that bad, because I think he is a symbol of a more egalitarian or progressive politics, and the European audiences and others know that. But he's a lot more popular in Germany, France, and the UK than he is here at the moment. So that's a bit of a problem.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.